Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Hoard's Dairyman monthly webinar series. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an associate editor for Hoard's Dairyman magazine. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar titled A Feed and Forage Outlook. This growing season has provided the United States with some extreme weather conditions, from drought to excessive moisture. This weather took a toll on forages, and our speakers today will discuss quantity and quality of 2021 forages, other factors that can impact ration costs, and the opportunities to utilize byproducts. We are lucky to have a pair of speakers with us for this webinar. First up will be Mike Rankin, Managing Editor of Hay and Forage Grower magazine. Mike earned his master's degree from Iowa State University. After working on a dairy farm for several years, he joined the University of Wisconsin Extension as a crops and soils agent in Fond du Lac County. After serving the agricultural community there for 27 years, he joined our team to become the managing editor of Hay and Forage Grower magazine, which is produced here in our office in Fort Atkinson. Our second speaker is Mike Hutjens, a familiar voice to our webinar listeners. Originally from Wisconsin, Mike graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison before working for University of Minnesota Extension. From there, he headed slightly south and has been working at the University of Illinois since 1979. As a dairy cattle nutrition specialist, he has shared presentations and information with people around the world. Other members of our team are our webinar producer, Jim Baltz, who's also at the University of Illinois, and our Hoard's Dairyman online media manager, Patty Hutjens. This month's webinar is sponsored by Christian Hansen. We are very grateful for their support of this program and helping us provide this educational information to all of our listeners. If you are listening to the presentation live today, you have access to a PDF handout of the slides. Some people like to print those out for future reference or to write notes on. So if you would like to do so, you can click on the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel and print out the slides. You can see those links down there. Also, if you have any questions for our speakers that come up during the presentations, please feel free to type them into the questions section, and we will address those after the PowerPoint presentations have been completed. I think with that, Mike, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar today, and I look forward to hearing your presentation and your thoughts on this topic, a feed and forage outlook for the year ahead.
All right, thanks, Abby. I guess I'll start it off first. I'm Mike Rankin with Hay and Forage Grower magazine, and we'll talk a little bit about the state of forage in 2021. Let's check out the growing season a little bit. I've pulled out here county average temperature ranks for June through August, which kind of take in the important part of the growing season typically on the left side. And just to note here, the amount of heat that was experienced in the western U.S. And really across the northern plains and Midwest and Northeast. But out here in the West, a number of counties experienced their record warmest period for June through August, going back to 1895 when records started being tracked. And then on the right, you'll see the precipitation ranks. And what you'll notice here is that we start to see a bit of a wet area down here in the Mid-South, and then also some dry areas across the upper plains and into the west. And this is going to show up again in no matter how we look at the data. As I look at a growing season, one of the things I always like to look at is when did the corn get planted? Because when the corn gets planted, goes a long way in kind of setting up the entire growing season. And what we find this year is that really by mid-May, the corn crop was essentially in the ground for most of the major corn growing states. So May 16th, 80% of the corn in the ground, and a week later, May 23rd, 90%. Now, there were some later states, Ohio in particular, in 1 week went from 39% up to 76. So long before the end of May, we had a corn crop in the ground, and so that's always, at least to me, encouraging as far as the growing season's concerned from a corn perspective. Drought monitor, just contrasting here. I like to look at late July, first part of August, right about the time corn's pollinating in the Midwest, and we see that a year ago there were some dry spots, but nothing compared to 2021, where almost all of the West is in a real drought situation, and also across the upper plains and even into Minnesota, down into Iowa, parts of New England were very dry. So it was one of those years where extremely dry if you were in the West or Northern Plains. And actually, what I like to look at even more so than the drought monitor is soil moisture. So this contrasts the middle of June with the beginning of August. And as we look at soil moisture, what's interesting here is a rapid expansion from the west to dryness into the plains and upper Midwest in terms of available soil moisture. And then if we look at the Midwest and even the Northeast, how those sections of the country really went from kind of wet to dry as we contrast the middle of June to the beginning of August. And the Mid-South just stayed wet. And if you look at states like Arkansas and Mississippi, Alabama, those folks down there, they didn't want to hear about drought. They just wanted the spigot to turn off for the majority of the growing season. Well, let's look at some data here. May 1st hay stocks in 2021 dropped, and that was about 2.5 million ton drop there that you see after actually going up the year previous. And we always like to, this kind of gives you an indication of where we are to start the growing season anyway, and how important it is that we have a good forage year or not. This is just dry hay. And so this was one of those years where we started down a little bit. And we'll see what happens come December when we get the December stocks report. In terms of going back to last year relative to that stocks report, from 19 to 20, alfalfa hay acres were up about 0.5%. Corn silage was up 1% in acres. And alfalfa haylage acres, at least in the 17 states that track this stuff in terms of haylage, and those states are listed there on the right, those acres were down 6.5% from 19 to 20. We won't know 21 until the report comes out in January. All right, prices. This is the average alfalfa hay price for September, going back to 2005. And what you see is the highest price we've ever had for alfalfa in September in this year, 2021. It sits at $209. That's almost $40 ahead of where we were at the same time last year. So that's kind of the position we're in, and we're going to talk look a little more at price here in a second. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what's keeping these hay prices so high. And certainly in 21, we can look at some of these production obstacles that we've already mentioned, things like drought. but also in the Northwest and West, excessive heat. I mean, we were talking temperatures of 110 to 120 degrees. And even if you have irrigated alfalfa, it's not going to like that kind of a temperature in terms of growing conditions. In some places, as we mentioned, there was too much moisture especially in the Mid-South this year, and for periods of time, even in other areas. Water in the West and for irrigation in some regions has become a big problem. Even this year, they cut back available water pretty significantly in some areas, and it's really going to be important to watch what kind of snowpack they get for example, the Sierra Nevadas this winter. Actually, they've had just a couple storms and some that are coming in now that have been quite favorable. We'll see if that continues. And then wildfires as well. I'll talk about that in a second. There's been logistic challenges in terms of boats and trucks. We've all probably read about the trucker shortage and the expense of containers coming across the ocean and sitting off the shore of LA and Long Beach there. That continues to be an issue. High commodity prices, corn and soybeans, for as long as I've been in this industry, anytime there were high commodity prices, generally hay prices followed. Continued strong exports, especially to China, and that's helping to support hay prices. So even though we have some of these challenges in terms of exports and imports, there has still been strong numbers in the export side of things for alfalfa. In 2021, USDA has forage acres and yields down. At least that's their forecast. There will be some regional differences. We'll see what happens when we get the final numbers in January. And then, of course, high input costs. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. This is a picture of a farm I was on out in California, not at the time that this picture was taken, but the producer sent me this. And this is a hay farm. It wasn't in line of the fires, but it just kind of shows how much smoke can blow in. And boy, if you're trying to get hay dry, or if you're trying to grow hay, I mean, you can imagine the effect on photosynthesis or just a lack of sunlight to get hay dry and extending the dry down time. So these wildfires can have more impact than what you might originally think. I'm no expert on world trade, but I can look at a graph like this that says world container index dollars per 40-foot container, and you can see that a little over a year ago that cost was around $2,000, and today it's around $10,000, and that price is going to get added on to anything that comes this way or goes out the other way. So huge impact. Fertilizer has just been an unbelievable market. So these are prices from the Illinois Production Cost Report. These are retail prices from 2 weeks ago. And actually anhydrous, which I have up 163% in the last year, October to October, is now over $1,200 a ton. Urea up 130%, DAP 90% up in a year, MAP 115%, and potash 137%. So, this has a huge impact, not only if you're buying hay, but also if you're producing hay. And if it costs this much more to produce hay or haylage on your farm, that has a direct relationship to what the value of that feed is, right? So either way, this is going to have a big impact going into 2022 on what kind of prices we're going to see moving forward, at least in the short to midterm. Talking to seed suppliers, seed supplies are going to be tight. I talked about that situation out west with the high temperatures and drought. And unfortunately, that's where most of our forage seed gets produced. And depending on the species, some of the production was cut well over 50% this year. You can see on this chart here which ones will be either in tight supply or extremely tight supply. I'm not going to go through all of these right now, but you can go back and look and take that in more detail. Here's the average monthly alfalfa hay price. I'm comparing 2020 to 2021. So let's look at those orange bars first, and you can just look at the difference between where we are today and where we were a year ago. I've already showed you that September price of $209. But as we, in a typical year, hay prices generally will peak in April and May and then start to slide down through the end of the year and then start to ramp back up again as we approach spring. So what's unique about this year is not only the high price, but the fact that hay prices have continued to increase throughout the summer and have virtually gone up every month during the production time of year, and that's really quite unique. That doesn't happen very, very often at all. So it's not just the high prices, it's just the fact that they kept going up through the growing season. Looking more at the really high quality hay, the supreme and premium quality alfalfa that a dairy producer is going to be looking at, and USDA tracks these costs or prices for the dairy margin coverage program, and these are the numbers that get used in determining feed costs for that program. But just to give you an idea where those are, and they take the average of the top 5 dairy states, and right now that number is sitting at $244 a ton. If we go back a year ago, less than $200 a ton. So dramatic increase in hay price value here. All right, this is the same thing, the premium and supreme quality hay from the various states. If you want to check out, California currently at about 250, Idaho 240, New York is up at 284, Texas at 243, and Wisconsin at 226. Those would be the states that are figured into that 244 average there. All right, let's look at some big picture things here. First of all, forage is going to be more expensive, both to purchase as well as to produce in the short and midterm, and prices are still climbing. Push the pencil on production inputs. If you're growing your own forages, legume and manure nutrients are going to be more valuable this year than ever, and make sure you take advantage of those, because the less commercial fertilizer you have to buy, the better off you're going to be, obviously. If soil test levels are high to excessive, keep in mind, there's a pretty low probability of a yield response from additional purchased fertilizer. Of course, that means you're going to have good soil tests to make those kinds of decisions. But that's a place where you can probably save if you have been banking some nutrients up until this point in time. Target those fields that are high to excessive, and just maybe think about not putting any or putting a lower amount on this upcoming year. Nitrogen's always going to be a good buy, so don't short your grass crops or corn crops in terms of nitrogen fertility. But again, you can still take advantage of legume and manure credits. A lot of people pre-order or prepay because of tax purposes. This year, that may or may not be a good strategy for tax, depending on the farm. But it may be something you need to do just to ensure that you're going to have that product when you're going to need it, because the pipeline is slow. Higher fuel costs are going to impact all forage production activities. If you hire a custom operator, if they haven't already raised the prices a little bit to cover fuel, if they're providing it, expect to see that next year. And of course, if you're producing your own crops as well. Inventories and quality vary by region and state, perhaps more so in 2021 with all the variation in weather and even variation within the season with weather. Water continues to be a huge concern in the West. Those non-irrigated acres out there really took a hit in 2021, and that's where a lot of the lower production is gonna be seen. Right now, they're forecasting alfalfa and alfalfa grass production to be down about 9%. Lower yields and lower acres in 2021. Keep an eye on that December 1st hay stocks report, and we'll know what the final numbers are come January. Hay exports trending slightly ahead of 2020. In fact, looking pretty good. China's up 35% this year, and overall we're up about 5%, and that's a lot of that gain has come in the last 2 months. So we'll see what happens toward the end of the year. Both the dairy and beef herds have been culled pretty heavily. That might reduce demand a little bit. I'm not sure it's going to be enough to really impact forage prices all that much. Continues to be interest in winter and summer annual forage crop systems. These vary widely in terms of what gets planted, but certainly a lot more of these kinds of forages are in the ground. And all I can tell you is you really need to test those forages because they vary all over the place in terms of how they can and should be used. Corn silage, for the most part, I think looks to be pretty good. Mike will talk more about that here in a second, but overall, pretty good spring for planting and a good fall for harvesting. So I don't see a lot of problems there.
And Mike, before Dr. Hutjens starts, we did have a question that came in wondering about the seed supply slide, wondering what the difference was between the ones that are marked with a C versus an I, following the seed name.
Sure. The C is the common varieties, and the I would be improved varieties. So I would be your better genetics. C would be your more common public kinds of varieties and those kinds of things.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it looks like I'm up to bat, as we'd say in the World Series. Hopefully, we won't strike out here. Let's take my 20-minute segment here, and then we'll open up for Q&A as well. Mike, very nice job as usual. Always great to share a microphone, and we jokingly call this the M&M program. Isn't that kind of sweet? Anyway, what we're going to cover here are 4 areas. Number one, looking at some of the quality issues that we have right now, and we've had tremendous support from our testing labs here. Then, as Mike referred to, a bit of outlook on corn and soybeans, an idea where it's going according to the University of Illinois economists here. Then a quick word about some of the byproduct feeds and the role of cover crops here in the future. And Mike alluded to that as well. And then, of course, increasing feed costs. And what are some of the strategies and some of the challenges I think we're hearing in the field right now. So here we go. Focus on forage quality. And I love this slide here. This comes from one of our commercial labs, just showing that, as Mike points out, the tremendous range. And you can see the percent of samples. And here, this data is a couple of years old, but still going to be a very apparent. And you can see the inherent advantages that some crops will have. You can see corn silage over there on the right. So here you want to be on the right. You want to be on the right side, not to be in politics, of course. But you want to be on the right side here. And you can see corn silage tends to have a little more of neutral detergent fiber digestibility at 30 hours. That's what the measurement is here listed. The new NRC is probably going to show that, I think, as small d, capital NDF, but we'll move on from there. But just look at the variation you have. And I look at some of the small grains, and you can see that they can actually tail out and challenge corn silage in terms of NDF digestibility. So let's take a look at some of our crops here. You're going to see a lot of data. And while there is a ton of data, the good news, Jim Baltz put it all on in the program. So you can go back and take a look at this. And so this comes from Cumberland Valley. You can take a look at all states average over there, the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Midwest, and West. You can take a look at it. You can look at starch levels on corn silage. It looks like the Northeast has a slight edge compared to the rest of us here, and the West a bit lower, maybe reflecting some of those heat increments as well. You look at NDF digestibility at 30 hours, which is a number I like, and again, it looks like the West will win there, but certainly acceptable numbers, as you'll see here in just a few minutes. Here's your grass forages. Of course, this covers a lot of area. A lot of different kind of grasses. You saw Mike's list there. And again, the same breakout here. You can see the protein levels sitting right around 16% in the Northeast. They tend to win there. And the West, lower. That could be different, obviously different types of grasses and different maturities as well. The NDF digestibility, surprisingly quite high. Take a look at that. That will challenge corn silage. And you can see in the West here, 65%, a very high number. I always like to look at RFQ, Relative Forage Quality Index, down there. And you can see these grasses are sitting right about the 130 range. Pretty predictable as far as that goes as well. Here's my legume forages. You can see again, they're reflecting the higher protein contents in that 20% range. Again, the highest number there is roughly 21% coming from the western part there. NDF levels, you can see again, lower in the western part. So that's not a big surprise at this point. And then you can look at all the rest of the numbers. There's not a lot of big differences there, at least in my eye when I look at this data. RFQ, again, you can see a nice number, 165. 165. Our thumb rule is for my dairy cows, I want to be over 150. So you can see most of this legume is going to make that as well. Here's your small grain forages. And again, the same, you take a look at these numbers at your leisure, pick your region. You can see how well you're competing here. And again, you can see on the small grains, I'm impressed with the Northeast. The RFQ sits at 154. That's a big time number down there as well. And of course, the Mid-Atlantic number looks well. Lots of numbers to look at. You can come back, print this off, and you can study these at your leisure or come back and listen to the webinar a bit later. Cumberland Valley also looked at 3-year averages, and that's a lot of lines. Jim Baltz did a nice job of getting it all illustrated here. If anything, maybe down just a little bit at some of the blue columns, depending on when you look at protein at first and second cut. So sometimes people like to look at that comparison as well. So there it is. We then look at grasses. Jim did another nice job here. Again, you can take a look at different cuttings of grasses here. And again, lots of different differences in the height of those bars. You can take a look at those at your leisure and go from there. We then go to Dairyland Labs. They sent here, this is corn silage, 36,000 samples. And I guess the good news is that there's not a lot of news here. If you take a look, they gave me the 2021 data, along with the 3-year average, and you can see the differences are very, very small. I want you guys and gals to keep an eye on that those ash numbers down there, because sometimes with moisture and rain and cutting approaches, those numbers can jump up a little bit higher from there as well. But certainly the corn silage looks quite good. Averages here just about 35% starch, certainly harvesting these crops at an optimal time. They also sent me some data, which I thought was pretty unique. First time I've had this data here. They pulled out the BMR. They could identify those in their labs, and there is no surprises there at all. The number you and I always want to look at is NDF digestibility at 30 hours. You can see the corn average is about 60, and BMR is around 68, and that's exactly what it's supposed to be at because it's a lower lignin, therefore increases digestibility. Starch, that doesn't surprise me either. I'm not sure that that's true of the BMRs, but our experience is generally the starch is a little bit lower than compared to our traditional hybrids out there as well. And you can look at that and compare whatever you're growing on your farms to see how that fits there as well. Here sits alfalfa haylage, roughly 15,000 samples of haylage. And again, as we mentioned earlier, not a lot of big news here. If you look, the one that catches my eye, of course, is a slight increase. I'm not sure that is statistical, but the point is 160 is pretty fancy haylage. And I'll feed that to my cows all day long and reap lots and lots of milk here and about 21% protein. Again, Dairyland probably reflecting pretty much of a Midwest pull as far as that goes. Here's your mixed hay samples. You can take a look at that. And again, you can see that's another category. Not a lot of big changes there in 2021, but the good news, RFQ stays where we want it to be, and we got those NDF digestibilities certainly acceptable. Then coming from Rock River, very busy, a bunch of slides here, and you can see what they're doing. This is Eastern haylage, and we're looking at such things as protein, NDF, NDF-D as well, and UNDF. And again, you can see if we look at crude protein, a slight shift, and then we saw that in some of the earlier data on the protein. The middle line is the average. The other two lines are standard deviations for you the statisticians out there. So you can see how these slopes move a little bit here. So there are some small trends and changes. That's Eastern haylage. Here's Midwest haylage. Just tons of data here. I'm not going to walk you through that. I'll let you be the detectives. You can be your experts here. And if you're Midwest hay, you can again see some of those curves moving just a little bit, but not significantly. And here sits Western haylage. Hay rather, and again you can see those same trends as they move along. And sometimes it's fun to go back and lay those side by side to see what's happening in your region as far as that goes. Again, here we go on Eastern corn silage, a listing again. Same format there. So I wanted to share all this data because it's beautiful data that these labs have presented to us. Here sits Midwest corn silage. You can see how that's moving around, and there are some shifts there as well. And here's Western corn silage. So lots of stuff to look at as well. New this year is Canadian data. This comes from the Maritime Province, and one of my former students in my class provided this to me. I want to thank them from Clarence Feeds. And NB is going to be New Brunswick. Prince Edward Island is PEI. NS is Nova Scotia, and NF will be Newfoundland. So again, these are pretty much all grasses that they're growing up there. These will be in the Maritime, so it's going to be that area, you know, where Mike had in his graph, Maine, above Maine as far as that goes. And again, lots of neat stuff to take a look at. And again, as you can review, this is going to be all grass. So how am I going to wrap this up? Well, Hutjens biases. Basically, I would hope that my legume and grasses are going to be over 50% NDF digestibility at 30 hours. That should be a 30 there. I didn't put that in there. My corn silage should be over 60. And so some of you may want those numbers higher, but that's your job as a dairy farmer, as a consultant, feed company personnel. Where are you going to set this level at? And then I go to Forage UNDF, and I'm really challenging my dairy farmers and my consultants and nutritionists to calculate this. It looks like I want that to be somewhere around 5 to 5.3 pounds of UNDF from forage sources. Does not include fuzzy cottonseed, does not include soy hulls, and so it's coming from forage sources. And the magic number sits around 4 to 4.2 pounds for jerseys, for smaller cows. If that number goes much above 5.3, I got a fill factor. In other words, the cows get physically filled up and can't eat more dry matter. If that number, for example, gets below 4.5, I may not have enough forage function in that diet to maintain rumen health and milk components. So those are my numbers. Should you adopt them? No. Look what you're having in your region, but certainly monitor those as well. So you can pretty much see lots of variation in forage quality depending on where you're living. So I want to thank my 4 major companies that they are listed for you. We want to thank them very much. Very short turnaround time here, especially with our corn silages coming in harvested here in September and October. So we're going pretty fast. Thanks, folks, very much for sharing. Number 2, and we're right on time, believe it or not, grain costs and outlook. And basically, these prices are about where we're at. Corn grain sitting at $5.40 a bushel. And the U of I here projects $5.45. So right on the money on that one. Soybeans had been quite a bit higher. In fact, we had some $6 corn as well earlier in the year. You'll see that here in Jim's overhead. But here sits my soybeans listing. We got them listed at about $14.20. And right now the U of I is suggesting basically $13 for beans. Beans have come down for a couple of reasons. First, we're not sure China is going to buy a lot of them. And second of all, those combines are really bringing them in, at least here in Illinois. A big crop, and just about every week ProAg is adjusting the yields, both corn and soybeans up as far as that goes. Soybean meal is sitting somewhere around about $340 a ton. That was up to $400 earlier in the summer. And of course, we had some dairymen that had locked her in at $290, and we're smiling all the way to the bank. We already covered Mike did a nice job on high quality hay, what it's worth there. And much like the commodities here, the byproducts tend to follow the commodity prices. So as corn goes up and soybeans go up, these dudes tend to go up as well. More about that in just a minute. So here we go with some pretty good ballpark numbers, showing you some numbers that were higher. In fact, some of the bushel prices were as high as $6. Some of the soybean meal prices were $400 a ton here. And Mike did a nice job on hay prices, so certainly variable there. And kind of a fun slide to look at. Jim, thank you very much for putting the corn in there, but you can see where we had actually times where we're at $3 corn. You're up in Minnesota coming out of the field, $3 a bushel corn a couple of years ago. And now you can see we're up there close to that $5.50 a bushel range as well. Soybeans, the same kind of story. You can see a lot of people had $8 beans, but one of our really good crop farmers saying, I'm not going to sell my beans. And he said, till they get to be $10, he finally got to sell those beans after about 4 years. I think he may have moved them a little bit than that, but that was his thought. He had to have $10 beans. And of course, now we have an impact there. Here sits your soybean meal prices. And again, you can see where we did get over $400 a ton there for a period of time. Now we're down around 300 and going from there. Okay, I thought this might be of interest to those of you that are online here today. Some regionality. You can see these are prices in Pennsylvania and then Wisconsin, Minnesota, picking up one of our farm magazines. And depending where you live, you can see corn can get quite expensive. And those of us who live in Illinois and Minnesota can get pretty cheap relative to the rest of the United States. There you can see some differences on soybean meal price at $20, $25 a ton. And fuzzy cottonseed, it can go a couple different directions depending on where you're at. And of course, the acreage on cottonseed or cotton this year is down as well. And so is the yield a little bit. So that's having Texas especially is being hit pretty hard on that as well. Let's say a quick word about the byproduct feeds and where we're at. By the way, this picture is our new feed mill here at the University of Illinois. It was just dedicated here a couple of months ago. And so if some of you have a lot of extra money, send it to our department. We could use a few dollars on the side, but beautiful, beautiful facility. What we have here, this is sesame from The Ohio State University. A colleague of mine sends this to me every month. And basically, this would be Midwest break-even prices. And so you can see the feeds listed there. I'll let you scan your eyes very, very quickly. And if you're in the green, that's a good buy. If you're in the red, it means it's not a good buy. You're paying a more premium for that. We'll have more comments on this as we go along. So basically, we'll look at corn. It says at $2, that's $5.60 a bushel. And the break-even price there, $1.89 a ton, that would be $5.29. So basically it says we're paying about a 31-cent premium, more so than another energy source in the feeding program. And now you can see why corn silage is so popular. It is $40, listed at $40 a ton. Although as that was last year's corn silage, this year's corn silage will be more expensive because a lot of people use the factor 10 times the bushel price of corn. So if you're chopping corn silage and corn was at $5.20 a bushel, then that price would be $52 a ton. Still a very good buy as well. Canola, we talked about, part of that is just the amount of drought stress we've seen in those areas. Here's the one some of you really want to take a look at. You can see some of you will remember when corn distillers grains was $160 a ton, and the beef feedlots were saying we can feed 60% of the dry matter coming from distillers grains and have nitrogen coming out of their ears. But again, you can see corn gluten, corn distillers are good prices. All the other ones are in the red. And while I'm not saying you should not feed them, it simply says that they are not, quote, good buys relative to the nutrient content. And that's based on energy, metabolized with protein calculated on sesame, and effective fiber and ineffective fiber. That's the basis they're using. You can also throw a key on that, and these are adjusted for amino acids. They look at amino acid content as well. I thought this year I would show you another breakout. This data was available to me, and now you can see that it's not a level playing field. And in other cases, you can see, look at corn prices. Are any of you surprised that we are the low prices on that? Look at fuzzy cottonseed. You can see the Southeast, because they're much closer to Texas and the Carolinas, they get a much better buy. And so you can see some real differences in these prices. I can't defend. I went back and double checked, Mike, that 351. I don't think that's right. I bet it's 251, but that is the data I had, and so I can't manipulate it. It's not my data. So we're just about out of time. Let's look at some feeding solutions as we wrap up my phase of the program here today. The price of milk, moles, shortage of forages, economic benchmarks, and feed efficiencies. We're going to spend about 1 minute on each of these as we go through it. Remember, if we are feeding dairy cows, we only get to set the peak milk curve one time in each lactation. We only get one bite of the apple, as we would say. So as a result, we are not going to let my high price feeds cut the lactation curve. Because we know high producing cows are most efficient and most profitable. So I'm going to take that milk. And finally, I'm going to say I never give up on milk. And this is a nice relationship. A pound of dry matter will cost me somewhere around 11 or 12 cents per pound of dry matter. Our feed costs and my budgets have gone up 20% compared to a year ago. Milk prices can vary, but I've got it plugged in at 17 cents a pound. And according to ProAg, that's going to be pretty close to the rest of 2021. But notice a pound of dry matter is going to give me 2 pounds of milk, and that's a profit of 22 cents a cow a day. And I'll take that to the bank all the time. And I tend to call that my marginal dry matter intake. And forages are such a huge factor in determining if I get that extra pound of dry matter into my high producing cows. This comes from a colleague of mine. He shows me some moldy corn. This is from this year, and that's bad news. Don't you feed that to my dairy cows, especially my dry cows and my younger heifers. That is scary at this point. And the question is, how much of a discount could we be looking at here? That was the question that came in last week. And the answer is, well, I'm going to take 56 pounds bushel weight on corn. I'm going to average roughly 10 pounds of corn to my cows. And so if I got to put a mycotoxin binder in at 10 cents, a cow a day, that means that's going to be about a 50 or 60 cent discount on that corn. And I don't want to feed that to my dairy cows. You can feed it to maybe some steers and get away with that. Ideally, maybe it should go to the ethanol plants, let them make ethanol out of it, but eyes wide open, folks. If you make ethanol out of this corn, guess where all that microtoxin is going to be? Yep, in the distiller's grain. So eyes wide open on that. And we think microtoxin, typically in that 3 to 6 parts per million, is a marker microtoxin, which means when you start seeing that number popping up, you probably have other microtoxins there, and that is the level in the total ration dry matter for dairy cattle. This is a fun slide that comes from the NRC. Some farmers are going to be short on forages this year, and so they said, well, how low can I go? And I think this is a beautiful PowerPoint. It shows that forage NDF, this is defined. I define forage, and this is my definition, that percent of the forages that are in the top 3 screens of the Penn State box in a 4-box system. So that includes feed on the 4-millimeter screen. And what this simply says is that as you start dropping down on forage NDF, and a lot of us will be somewhere around 20, 21%, but as you start dropping that down, then you're going to raise the NDF levels up on this one, primarily probably from byproduct feeds, and I'm going to lower the starch load. So that's a really nice slide. And then be well aware, starch is not starch, is not starch. We know wheat starch is different than corn starch, and high moisture corn that's been fermented for 6 months is different than fresh high moisture corn. So a little bit Kentucky windage, but a person at a conference last week said, boy, he says that chart works like a champ, because he's using it. Here are your budget numbers you can take a look at. The big numbers. I argue every dairy farmer in Illinois and Wisconsin and California and in Europe, you'll have to use your numbers as well. This is my cost. So you can see my feed budget. Notice I'm cheating a little bit. This forage is a combination of 2/3 corn silage and 1/3 alfalfa. It was all alfalfa. That would be somewhere around 11 cents. And so you can see I'm going to add another $1. So how you feed forages can have a real impact there. The grain cost a little high when I did this budget, come down a little bit, but look at the numbers at the bottom. Remember this, 49 pounds of dry matter at $5.76, and that means that's costing me 12 cents per pound of dry matter. Every dairy farmer must know that number. The cost to feed 100 pounds of milk does not include dry cows, does not include heifers, that you can see with an 80-pound tank average. I'll let you Europeans adjust that for kilograms, but you can see about $7.20 is my feed cost there. And of course, that makes up nearly half the cost of producing milk on farms. Income over feed costs here would be $10.80. Illinois, I need 11. I need 11 to make that happen. And then my feed efficiency is 1.63. And so those are 4 tremendous benchmarks that forages has a huge factor in adjusting as far as that goes. And I'm just going to go through this on feed efficiency, and you can look at that at your leisure. Here are some nice guidelines from The Ohio State University. And let me tell you, folks, there's dollars on the table. If I can move feed efficiency from 1.4 to 1.5, that's an extra 41 cents a day. And anytime you can find 22 cents or 41 cents or 10 cents on a cow per day, you had a good session. So with that, I'll stop, Abby, and turn the program back to you.
Dr. Hutjens, thank you. We had one question that pertains to your slide, so I will just ask that now. Early on, you had listed grass forages in one of your first slides, and this person just wants to know what that all includes.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I wish I had one of my lab peoples on. I think the farmer checks that box when he sends that sample in, and he says, this is grass sample, and then it is then analyzed by NIR. Mike, do you agree with that?
Yeah, when you look at those averages like that, I mean, you're going to get just about any kind of grass. And you're going to get samples from dairy producers, from beef producers. So when you look at those averages, you got to keep in mind that probably your dairy samples are going to be above those averages.
Very good. So Mike and Mike, thank you both so very much for being a part of our webinar today and sharing this timely information and then some of your insights and predictions for the year ahead. That's greatly appreciated and very useful. And I hope our listeners thought so as well. I also want to thank Christian Hansen once again for sponsoring this webinar. We certainly appreciate their support of our program and all that they do for the dairy cattle industry. Our next webinars are coming up in December and January, so we hope that you'll mark your calendars. In December, we'll be focusing on caring for calves in cold climates and cold weather, and our presenter will be Sarah Morrison from the Miner Institute, and that webinar will be sponsored by Agroplastics. And then in January, to kick off 2022, we will have a dairy situation and outlook for the year presented by Mark Stevenson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So once again, our webinars will continue to be the second Monday of each month, and we hope that you will make plans to join us again in the future. And also, if you want to go back and watch this webinar or any of our past webinars, they are all available on our archive, hoards.com, and there's a webinar tab. So feel free to check them out there if you want to review a webinar again or share it with somebody else. We had a few questions that came in prior to the webinar, so I will go through these now, and Mike, you can, either one of you or both can jump in and answer these. So this question came from a person in Arizona. Given the current and future uncertainties of ration supplies, are insect proteins being considered as an option for livestock rations? And there's been some work done at Texas State University that is kind of trialing this right now. So your thoughts?
Well, Mike, why don't you go ahead and bring them up to speed? You're more closer to what's going on here in Illinois, actually.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that this looks to be a viable strategy. At least initially, the problem is going to be, can that kind of feed be competitive with other feeds in terms of price? And even I think the industry feels that it's going to take a few years for that to happen. That said, there's a huge amount of research being done, and in fact, I read here a while back that ADM, along with a French company, were in the process of building a rather large plant in Decatur, Illinois. So there's certainly a future in this area, and time will tell.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, the limited stuff I've seen, this can be a pretty good quality protein, to be very honest. And there's some talk of maybe on the human side that this might be a resource as well.
Thank you for that. Dr. Hutjens, will send this one to you first. Dry hay is really expensive and in some cases quite unaffordable. What are some feeding strategies to replace alfalfa in dairy rations?
Well, Abby, I think that's a neat question. And the question is, well, what are we replacing in the dry hay? If it's physically effective fiber, that becomes very important. Some of my cover crops, some of my grass silages, some of my small grain silages could fit in very nicely here, as could be corn silage if it's chopped correctly at this point. If it's protein, then obviously we can be looking at some of the byproduct feeds that come into play. So I think that's what I'd be looking at in my plate, would be looking at some of the alternative forage crops that might be available on my farm or locally available here, and then some of the byproduct feeds. But remember, the byproduct feeds by and large are not going to bring much physically effective fiber. And if you don't chop the corn silage correctly, then again, or more haylage, it may not be able to be the same substitute that we have with dry hay. My Penn State boxes, dry hay, we usually give them effective fiber around 92 to 97%, alfalfa 92, grass 96, 97. That's a Dr. Sniffen number. My silages are going to be, if chopped right, are going to be up in the 80% levels there. Chopped wrong, it could be as low as 60%.
All right, our next question. In areas where corn and other forages face drought stress, how does that change their nutritional profile compared to non-drought stressed crops?
Yeah, I'll start that, and Mike, then you can jump in. We were recently at a webinar at a program, and when does the drought hit? And according to this agronomist, he said that if the dry condition is in the vegetative stage, which is pre-tasseling, then we're going to have a shorter plant height, and that will increase NDF digestibility. Now, he says if it happens after silking, of course, it's got to pollinate properly. Mike alluded to that earlier. It happens after silking, then we're going to be looking at grain yield. And of course, that's starch content and energy density. So generally speaking, when does a drought hit can impact one of those two variables there. In most cases, Mike, our experience has been it feeds quite good. Your comments?
Yeah, I would certainly agree. It depends when the drought hits, because where you're really going to affect things is if you're dry during pollination. Generally speaking, drought will impact yield more than quality. But when I used to get this question when I worked in extension, and how do you price drought stress crops? It's hard to do. I would generally just take a round number, something like 80% in terms of value. But by and large, yield's going to be impacted more than quality.
Yeah, let me throw out two more numbers, Mike, just for our listeners. Number one is that it's not very hybrid specific. In other words, a drought stress, how much is that difference? Some Michigan data would suggest about 6 points higher in NDF digestibility on drought stress corn. Remember everything we talked about earlier. And another guideline is every foot less of the plant you have could be the equivalent of about a ton of dry matter per acre. And of course, there's a lot of Kentucky windage on both of those numbers here, but just gives you a feel of the impact you can have on NDF digestibility. Pretty significant, maybe a 10% increase, and yield could be significant as well.
Yeah, and it could be very high starch too. You can have a short plant with a normal ear, and that's going to be a high starch plant.
Good point. Mike Rankin, this question I'll send to you first. What percentage of the Western alfalfa crop was exported last year? And this listener commented, will we continue to allow other countries to buy our water via forages, or is the price differential too great to ignore the export opportunities?
Ah, boy. Yeah, this would be good for another hour presentation. As you look at the Western alfalfa crop, the numbers that we've determined, now for grass, it's a significant percent, probably a little over 40% of the grass hay production in the West, but only about 17% of the total alfalfa production in the far western states goes for export. And it's not that we're shipping a lot of quote unquote water there in that hay, which is quite dry. Actually, it's the water that's used to produce the alfalfa, most of which just recycles through either transpiration or leaching or evaporation. So a lot of that water recycles, but there is a lot of research going on right now looking at producing alfalfa in the West with less water, because they know that the amount of water they're going to probably have available is going to continue to be less and less. I would point the person that asked the question, Dan Putnam at the University of California, Davis, has done a lot of writing and presentations on this, and I think we've got maybe a URL to a paper he wrote in the chat box that goes into a lot more detail on this particular thing. But it's a valid question, and one that we need to consider as we move forward.
Yes, you all should be able to find that linked handout that Mike was just talking about if you go to the chat section. So, all right, we had a good group of questions come in, so I am going to start asking these now. I think this one both of you could talk about. Dr. Hutjens, we'll start with you first. Should Midwest dairy producers begin to consider forage sorghum as a backup crop to hedge against drought?
Oh, that's a good question, and there are some farmers that are doing that. I looked at the data from Texas A&M, and sorghum is not corn silage, but then again, sorghum is better than no corn silage at all. So certainly that's an alternative. Mike, I guess I might be more looking at maybe the sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, BMRs, for example, and go that direction. So not a lot of experience with the forage sorghum. Mike, your comments?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's forage sorghum or whether it's sorghum Sudan, you definitely, if you're going lactating cows, you definitely want to move toward the BMR. They do well in the Midwest if we have the right growing conditions. If it's a cool, wet summer, then they're not going to do very well. And I've seen, train wrecks because of that. But if there is a drought or if it is dry, which obviously it can be, you know, they produce very well. Sorghum Sudan grass, you can get multiple cuts off of. The one thing about the sorghum, especially the forage sorghum, is, how you going to get it dry? I mean, a lot of times you have to either cut it and wilt it, which is tough, or you have to wait for a frost and then wait for it to dry down, and that becomes a problem too. But it can be done. It is good feed. It's not corn silage, but it is very good feed. And there's been plenty of research to show that cows will milk on it. So that's what I would say.
Very good. Thank you. This next question will start with Mike Rankin. More specialty varieties of forage seeds have become available. Other than Harv Extra, what are some of the most exciting new forages on the horizon? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, in the alfalfa world, of course, it's improved digestibility, reduced lignin with the Harv Extra trait, and beyond that, in terms of what's out there right now, some things that have been out there, relate more to the standability and improved yield, improved disease resistance. I guess the thing that I'm most excited about is the efforts to get a small percentage of tannin into the plant. Tannin only occurs in the seed of alfalfa, but they're working on, and what that actually will do is reduce the amount of soluble protein in alfalfa, and from an environmental perspective, in terms of greenhouse gas losses and animal productivity and useful protein, it's going to be a game changer. I don't know when it's going to happen. I know they've been working on it, but when it does happen, I think it'll be huge.
Okay, good. Dr. Hutjens, I think this question will send your way. What is an upper price level when purchasing legume hay that would be detrimental to the return on investment, and are we there yet? I think you had some slides on this topic, but maybe a few more thoughts here.
Yeah, so Abby, it's a good one. If you look at sesame, then you got one answer right there, and we're right there. We're at that point. But if I put in 3 or 4 pounds of hay, and my cows give me an increase of let's say 6 or 7 pounds of milk, wow, that hay could be worth $300+ a ton because of its impact it's having on rumen health and productivity, and in some cases components. So it's an interesting question. So if you want to play hardball and just use a computer model, I think we're there. And some of Mike's numbers, boy, I'm a little nervous about $244 a ton. But if my cows understand what it can do, then we've already penciled it out using those kinds of assumptions up to over $300 a ton. So my answer there.
Okay, kind of a related question. What do you think about an all corn silage ration using no hay at all?
I'll be honest with you, Abby, I'm not a big fan of it. I know some people who've tried it and they get away with it at this point. I would like to, I could see you going as high as 80% of the forage dry matter coming from corn silage, assuming it's kernel processed, and you've got that 3/4 inch theoretical length of chop. Notice all those caveats that are coming in here right now. But if you look at what I call fragility, or rather Rick Grant says fragility, alfalfa has a fragility, it has more of a scratch factor associated with it, where I find when my top 5 Penn State box, when I shake it out, it's a very soft forage type. So I'm going to take that remaining 10 to 20% and I'm going to bring it in either as a small grain cover crop type thing over the winter, or I'm going to bring it as an alfalfa source, either as baleage or hay at this stage of the game. That's a very biased answer.
There you go. We asked for your opinion, so very good. Thank you for sharing. And that is all for the questions related to this topic today. So Mike and Mike, thank you both for offering that insight on these additional questions that came in. And once again, I want to thank Christian Hansen for sponsoring this webinar and supporting our efforts to share information with both dairy producers and the people who work with them. If you enjoyed this webinar, I hope you'll make plans to attend some of our future webinars in December on the 13th. We'll be talking about caring for calves in cold climates. That presentation by Sarah Morrison from the Minor Institute. And then we'll kick off the new year with a dairy situation and outlook. So please, we hope you'll make plans to join us for one of those or both of those presentations. And last but not least, I want to thank Mike and Mike for being our presenters for this webinar. We really appreciate all the insights that you shared with us today. And of course, all of you in the audience, I want to thank you for joining us. It's always our goal to provide information that's useful for you, whether it's on your dairy farm or with the people you work with. And we're thankful that you take time out of your busy schedules to join us. So thanks for being here. Until next time, goodbye from all of us here at the Hoard Dairyman team and our partners at the University of Illinois.